Okay, so I think we should go ahead and get started. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to tonight's April 10th, fourth class with Tony Papert on what to do about our failing, horrible schools. If you haven't participated in the previous classes, I would encourage you to go to the LaRouche PAC website where you will find those classes available and be able to go back and watch them. And in before I turn it over to Tony, I just wanted to make a few opening comments to situate where we are as the discussion that we have been embarking on for this class series is not just about what is going wrong with the failed policies in gender identity, the critical race theory, but where this comes from as the intention of an oligarchical system, a system that wants to keep people enslaved and to stop the process of creative development amongst human beings and amongst our students. And so I wanted to share tonight, first of all, what everyone should be doing as they're addressing this issue, to go to the highest level of understanding of what the threat is that we're facing in our society against the young people, but against the society as a whole. And I wanted to share that one of our supporters here has really nailed what has to be at the forefront of debates going on in the education system, board of educations, going on of students running for school, people running for school board. He put out one supporter just submitted to the local paper an editorial here in Texas. And two things he talks about in that editorial takes up a lot of what Tony has been discussing in his previous talks on this series, going to the question of what has been the threat of the drill and grill education system, but most emphatically the question of how it is, what preoccupies parents throughout the United States, as this one supporter puts it, what preoccupies parents throughout the United States about their schools is that America's children may be subjected to curricula so dumbed down and based on drill and grill that all human creative potential is distinguished.
Terrific.
Very important. And he goes on to say that what needs to be addressed is that we have to start with three traits which are closely interrelated. A, independent thinking, original thinking, and C, the ability, B, originally thinking, and C, the ability to focus long and intense concentration on problems. And finally, I'm not going to read through the entire statement, but I just wanted to make these points because I want Tony to address this as he has been. That what has come up in discussion previously has been the question of the Platonic Socratic method of the Republic. And this individual writes why this has to be a leading discussion in our education system. How do we go back to the Socratic teaching method of instruction, strictly defined, is the critical examination of the axioms implicitly underlying assumptions rather than seeking to define and adopt positions by tricks of debate. So this is what he is taking to school board officials, candidates running for school board. And I think this is absolutely important, especially as we look at what has been the devastating agenda coming out of the British imperial oligarchical system against human creativity, as was the lifelong commitment of the now deceased Prince Philip, who people should not be praising, but understanding what this man's life represented. Which should not be a model for anyone. So if you did not have a chance to see it, I'm not going to spend much time giving praise or credence or anything to Prince Philip. But what people should do is go to the LaRouche PAC website, and we put out I guess you can call it a eulogy on how not to live one's life and to express how, along with the oligarchical method that he represents, along with evil people like Bertrand Russell and others that have been at the antithesis of what a real creative society should be, against human creativity, talking about culling the herds, and really where this insane education policy has come from. That what we are discussing is how we bring about the true principles of creativity and defined as the mission outlined in our Declaration of Independence and outlined in the ideas of all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and what these rights are that cannot be taken away from us. Finally, today in discussion, I think this goes very much in the context of what we're going to be talking about tonight. This has been mentioned earlier in our earlier calls, that LaRouche PAC has initiated a twofold campaign. And particularly, I wanted to make the point, if you have not seen it, we are in the midst of joining and of backing the boycott campaign of President Trump against the corporatist companies, the so-called woke companies that are at the center of this destructive policy. And I think it's important, as was discussed earlier amongst some of our associates today, of what is the real strategic picture behind President Trump's boycott. It's not just to say don't drink Coca-Cola or don't fly on Delta or don't go to baseball games, but is how these companies have been immersed and are right at the center of this oligarchy and this corporatist agenda against our Constitution, and why we have to expose this as the real operation and the real enemy in terms of against our true republic. So that's what we're talking about here tonight. I will post up the boycott, the corporatist boycott the woke companies petition and statement that LaRouche PAC has put out in response to what President Trump is doing, and how you can get involved in that more. Otherwise, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. For those who are on for the first time, you can get into the discussion once we get after Tony finishes his opening remarks and presentation by pressing *9 if you're on the phone line, or raising your hand. And I would encourage people to get in early so that you can participate in the discussion. So with that, Tony has a lot to go over, so I want to get to you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Keisha. I just would begin by trying to address what she asked on the principle of education as Platonic dialogue. And I was just reading Lyndon LaRouche writing on that subject in this compendium, which I think is very useful, of a lot of his writings on education, which is called Genius Can Be Taught, which is available, alas, on Amazon, which we're going to boycott, so we've got to get it available on something else. But what he said there is that among many other things, what he said is that what you get from the principle of Platonic dialogue in education is that you come to know that prevailing opinion is always wrong. And then going on from that, he said, now this is very relevant to our discussion tonight because I'm going in a context which I'll describe soon. I'm going to be discussing Homer's Iliad as a subject of education in K through 12 schools. Lyndon LaRouche said that students should begin reading the Iliad, the Odyssey at the age of 8. And that seems a challenge. We can discuss that more. But on that sort of subject, and also addressing that beautiful letter the person wrote to the re-education to his local newspaper, Lynn said that if the most gifted students at any age can master a given material, he doesn't say what it is, but can master anything, then all the other students can too, because the most gifted can help them. That what is goodness itself, but learning to help other people develop in themselves what they can contribute to the common good. In other words, to say it another way, totally other way, I guess, the mutual supportive teaching of the students must be a part of education. Learning to do that, teaching them to do that, it must be a part of all education, and it is a part of the Platonic dialogue. And it goes with something else. I'm not going to be quoting Lynn for the rest of the period, but I'm quoting him now. It goes along with something else he said, which is very relevant to today's education driven by the scholastic aptitude test and college admissions and all this nonsense. He says, superior achievement, for instance, in school students, must be valued as a quality of leadership rather than a competitive advantage. Superior achievement must be valued as a quality of leadership rather than competitive advantage. And that's obvious how that goes with what I just said. So this is number 4, as we said in this class series, on we require classical education for our students. We're talking especially K through 12, because they should be graduated with the knowledge required to be a citizen, which means with the knowledge required to be an official, potentially with the knowledge required to be a president, and also, by the same token, with the knowledge required for any specialization. Now, this 4th class is going to be the last one I'm going to teach. It's going to be followed in 1 week, next Saturday, by Bruce Director on constructive geometry. If there's time, I'll say a little more at the end about what he's going to do. And then the following week by Miwa Steger, who is a very gifted professional level musician, who is going to be discussing the beginning, or at the beginning and probably more, of education, inducing students or bringing students in at preschool level into the beginnings of the well-tempered system, so that they can be, by the time they're in high school, they can be performing in an ensemble certain works of Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven. So that's to say it in brief. Now, so the first question is, what is a classic? And this is very relevant because I just was reading, or you can read anything on the internet, that a guy gave what he said was a classical reference. And the reference was to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So is Lord of the Rings a classic? What is a classic? Now, rather than answering that by a description, I'm going to be dealing with Homer's Iliad, which is an epic poem capturing a mere 50 days near the end of the 10-year war at Troy, the Trojan War, where all the Greek city-states had gathered their forces, invaded Troy, fought on the plains of Troy and around Troy for 10 years before finally winning the war. In the Iliad, they don't win the war, but it's a 50-day period at the end of that 10-year war. Now, the Iliad has been known in all of Western civilization since more than just simply Greek. It's of course written in Greek, but it's been known by all of Western civilization since centuries before Christ. But what I'm going to describe now is the way in which this poem, in ways which nobody could have predicted or foreseen, this poem, in the hands of a handful of geniuses of the 19th century and the 20th century, opened up an entire new understanding of the whole history of European civilization, that is Mediterranean civilization, going back about a millennium before anything that was known before. And the door that opened that up to us was the Homeric Iliad. Now, since Britain became the modern form of the British Empire, just decades before our American Revolution, the British have been a world empire dominating the sciences, dominating history, dominating also the arts, and dominating archaeology, which is especially easy to do because they could control who could dig where to find archaeological remains, because they controlled most of what today we call the third world. So they dominated archaeology, and with their bestial, brutal ideas of humanity, they thought that Greek history, and therefore, Greek history, and in that sense, European history, only went back as far as our written Greek records, which don't go much back much before 700 BC, 800 BC. So the Iliad describes a battle which traditionally Greeks considered took place in 1200 BC. And from the side of the British, Archbishop Usher, as hearers may know, decreed that the world had been created in 4000 BC. So admittedly, that was before 1200 BC, but it didn't give very much time for people to get out of the Garden of Eden and populate Greece and all these things. So, and Isaac Newton had a different view. He believed the world was created in 3998 BC. So they insisted that the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but we're mainly here concerned with the Iliad, but in both cases, they judged that these were fantasy mental creations, just like J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, that there was no Trojan War, there was no Troy. And a few British people disagreed, but that was the view of British archaeology. Now, and would it still be our view today? I don't know that that's an answerable question. It's just as I asked myself, would we have gone to the moon if not for the Soviet Union and Sputnik? It's far from obvious to me that we would ever have gone to the moon. As you remember, Kennedy broke out of the British imperial control to set us on the path to the moon, and almost immediately he was assassinated. And the impetus, of course, for that moon mission was the Russians' Sputnik satellite in 1957. So would we have gone to the moon but for the Soviet Union? It's not clear in my view. And would we still believe that Greek history went back as far as 700 or 800 BC and then stopped and didn't go further, were it not for a brilliant German named Heinrich Schliemann? Schliemann lived from 1820 to 1890. He was a very gifted polymath. He taught himself more than half a dozen languages, perhaps a dozen, among them ancient Greek. And at the age of 8 or 9, when youth are beginning their education and asking themselves, what is it all about? Is there a God? Can I make a contribution to humanity? Schliemann talked with a girlfriend of his, also 8 or 9, and they vowed that they would dig up Troy. Schliemann believed that what Homer said was true, contrary to all learned opinion, few exceptions. He believed that what Schliemann said was true and vowed that he would excavate and find Homer's Troy. And what he did basically well, he lived in 70 years. What he did was, he was a man who never went to university, like some of the other people I'm going to describe. But he built himself up as a fabulously wealthy businessman for the purpose of excavating Troy. Because the way archaeology worked in that way in those days was, it was a preserve of the wealthy. You had to buy the archaeological site before you could dig on it. So he had to get up the money to not only hire teams of laborers to excavate and all these things, but actually to buy the entire site of Troy. So it was by those who agreed that Troy existed, it was agreed that it was on the eastern coast of Asia Minor, basically what we would call today on the eastern coast of Turkey. But exactly where was not clear. Schliemann, using the precise descriptions of Homer of the battle and the battlefield and the distances involved and the times involved, eliminated all the other candidates for the location of Troy, except a Turkish village named Hisarlik, which he proceeded to excavate and found a series of 6 or 7 fortresses buried one on top of the other, one of which had been indeed the city of Troy, which was attacked and eventually defeated and conquered and burned to the ground by the Greeks in the process depicted in the Iliad. So this completely overturned the world of British-dominated archaeology, never to land on its feet again. But Schliemann didn't stop there. As people know who have read the Iliad or read about it, the leader of the entire Greek expedition was the senior king, the king of all the Greek. They were all kings leading the expedition, but the king of all the kings was named Agamemnon, and his capital city was called Mycenae. And Schliemann immediately left Troy, excavated Mycenae, and found indeed the things which Homer had said were there, and the things which Pausanias, much later, Christian era, I believe he was, Greek travelogue writer, had found at Mycenae at that time. And he went on to dig up Tiryns. Tiryns, as far as I remember, didn't send a king to the Iliad, but Tiryns was famed as the strongest fortress in the world, with the biggest and strongest stone walls. It was supposed to be the fortress of Hercules. And Schliemann dug that up. So, I mean, a whole new history was opened up, which people had denied had existed, which was that Homer was describing something which was real in 1200 BC or thereabouts when the Trojan War took place. And again, so it completely changed, right with that thing, it changed our knowledge of our origins as a Mediterranean civilization. It changed our notion of the origin of Western civilization and the progress of Western civilization, which has continued with fits and starts to develop since. The next, Schliemann set his sights on the city of Knossos on Crete, which was another great center of a powerful kingdom, named and described in detail by Homer in the Iliad. As Schliemann went, as he had in previous cases, to go and try to buy up the city of Knossos in Crete, and he thought he had bought it up, but some title disputes, people who are buying houses know about this, some obscure title disputes arose, and it wasn't clear he bought it. And as far as I recall, he died. He died and he collapsed in the street in Italy in 1890. And nobody knew he was anybody special at the time. He was just a 70-year-old man. And I think he was given no special rapid medical attention. He died then and there during the ongoing dispute over the ownership of Knossos in Crete. The guy who had been blocking Schliemann's ability to buy the site was a wealthy Englishman named Sir Arthur Evans, who was, well, hereditarily wealthy, academically incompetent. He could draw halfway decent, and he had an interest in antiquities, and he was recruited by the British to buy Knossos, Crete, before Schliemann could get there, which he did, and begin to excavate it himself. And basically, I won't go into detail on that, but he made a mess of everything. You can read about, I mean, there's a very good book by a German geologist called The Secret of Crete. I mean, if you go to the, what Evans did was make Crete into a tourist attraction. So he built all kinds of things. He provided furniture and decor. In fact, the last time I looked, the grand entrance hall of the palace in Crete, of Knossos in Crete, was listed among the leading sites of Art Nouveau. Now, I don't know if you know what Art Nouveau is. Art Nouveau is a 1920s style of stupid-looking furniture. So he stuffed it with 1920s furniture. People who go to Knossos in Crete look at the frescoes on the walls, and they say, my God, it looks exactly like French Impressionism. Well, there's a reason for that. When Evans came there, you couldn't tell what the frescoes were, but he hired a bunch of Impressionist artists from Paris to so-called restore the frescoes. So they painted French Impressionistic art in the Palace of Knossos, where it is today, and you can go see it for a fee. Anyway, now there's another question. This is full of questions, and what it involves is the memorability of poetry, the ability, and this came in part in my discussion of astronomy, really over the last 2 weeks. But you find that, and I think as I said then, that astronomical observations in ancient times were made into poetry and versified. So the one result is they were immediately memorable. Yeah, I remember describing this. If you can learn it and you never forget it. So you never forget which is the point of it in part, you never forget the relevant astronomical observation. So, I mean, if Homer was right, if what Homer said was true, he was describing the siege of Troy in 1200 BC or 1250 BC. And then what I haven't yet said, but this is central to the whole thing, immediately, and it's in the Greek epic, immediately after the fall of Troy, Greece and pretty much the entire Western Mediterranean, if not more of the Mediterranean, lapsed into a terrible dark age, which was worse than any dark age we've seen. Or for instance, worse than the dark age we saw at the end of the collapse of the Roman Empire. I mean, this is of intense interest to us today, because if our efforts fail, we will proceed further downward into an endless, limitless dark age. I mean, as I described, we have actually been in a cultural dark age since about 1900, but it's our ability to win this fight now that determines whether we can rise out of it or we're going to fall irredeemably into it. The East Greece, what was then Greece, and the Mediterranean, especially the Western Mediterranean, fell into a total dark age from, say, 1200. Actually, you could put that chronology on the screen. I have a chronology, but I'm trying to, since I know many of you are listening on the phone rather than watching the video, I'm trying to not make you rely on that chronology. But the Greece fell into a dark age. Again, of course, these dates are not precise, but from somewhere around the fall of Troy, somewhere 1200 BC to something like 800 BC. It was tremendous depopulation. The majority of the villages which existed in 1250 BC, 1300 BC, no longer existed in 800 BC, 900 BC. The population plummeted. The art of writing was completely lost. This was a dark age of unparalleled degeneration. I mean, if you want a view of it, actually, you can take another ancient writer, which is Aesop, of Aesop's fables. And many of you, I'm sure you've read Aesop's fables. Aren't you? Isn't it interesting that all the animals in Aesop's fables are starving? They're all literally starving. They're an hours from starving to death. I mean, you think of I don't remember particular fables at the moment, but an animal is caught, is stuck someplace. Well, he has hours to get out because within hours he's going to starve to death. The animals, of course, the fables contain largely animals, but they represent the people of the time. This was a dreadful dark age. Now, the question is, there are many questions involved in that. How did we get into such a dark age? The question we have to ask ourselves now. But one question is, how was it possible that knowledge of the Trojan War could last for centuries of a dark age without writing? It seems completely impossible. And yet this riddle was solved by an American scholar named Milman Parry. Actually, why don't you put that other chronology up? Milman Parry, well, he lived in the early part of the 20th century. And he was wrestling with this question also, because the whole thing really had been opened up by Schliemann's explorations and what I've described. How was it possible to carry the knowledge and to carry the poem, to carry the knowledge and to carry the poem, which is a poem of considerable length, through centuries without writing? So Parry analyzed the structure of the Homeric poems and found that they were not composed of individual words, or even individual phrases. They were composed of larger units, which sometimes called formulas, which are, let's call them stereotyped or set expressions from two words to two lines. So two lines might be, 30 syllables, 35 syllables, maybe what, however many words you want to make of that, 8 words or even longer. So that, because you continually find lines repeated in different parts of the Iliad, but where you don't find lines repeated, you find formulas you repeat. Now, the other thing you find is you find formulas in the sense which I'm saying it, you find formulas repeated with variation allowed in the formula. So what that means is that in Milman Parry's estimation of it, what that meant was a poet who obviously, this takes great skill of training and intellect, but a poet could recite a poem of the magnitude of the Iliad, in effect from memory, by, constructing it from this very rather large list of formulas and substituted formulas and so forth, which he had in his mind. So he could recite the Iliad itself, presumably over a period of several days, orally, with no use of writing. And Parry theorized that and went, I don't remember exactly the order in which he did things, but he went into present-day Yugoslavia, to the areas which are present-day Yugoslavia, and found poets, bards, doing precisely that, reciting oral epic poems, not the length of the Iliad, but reciting oral epic poems, and not from memory, that it's different each time, like a good performance of music. Each performance is different and presumably better than the last, because you've thought more about it and so forth. And this is done without the use of writing. So this, again, was a tremendous breakthrough, which gave us a window into a history which we hadn't known existed. Now, so, I mean, to briefly exemplify that, I want to leave time for discussion. To briefly exemplify that, what it meant in the detail of the poem is that features of what we call Mycenaean Greece, because of Schliemann's excavations at Mycenae, that is Greece before 1300 BC, Greece from 1800 or so to 1300 BC, which was not known to exist at all 150 years ago. We find that the poet in historical times, 800, 900 BC, is reciting as part of his poem things which he has never seen and never could have seen, but he knows of them from the poem itself. He doesn't necessarily know a lot about them, but he knows they're part of the poem, and recites them as such. So a famous example is the shield of Ajax. Ajax was allegedly one of the Greek heroes of Troy, although actually he wasn't. He was a Greek hero of centuries earlier in Mycenaean Greece, who was transported by the magic of poetry into the siege of Troy. And with him were transported, because this form of oral epic poetry, the Homer, what we call Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were not the first examples. This was recited in Mycenaean Greece broadly beyond the examples we have, way beyond the examples and subjects we have today. Ajax was one of the subjects. He lived centuries earlier. His equipment, his weaponry was different from that which was actually at Troy. And one thing he had was a shield like a tower. So the poet, say Homer, in 800 or 900 BC, found himself with a poem which described a shield like a tower. He had no idea how a shield could be like a tower, but nevertheless, it was part of the poem. And the poem describes how Ajax would pick up this shield, which was fixed in the ground by posts, bring it to a new location, stick it into the ground, strap it over his left shoulder, which you can't do with any other kind of shield, and fight from behind it like a moving fortress. So the poem describes all this, although nothing like that existed at the time the poem was being recited and ultimately written down between 8 or 900, 600 BC. It carried forward like a fly in amber the features of a culture which had not existed for centuries. And I mean, clearly also it carried forward basic features of the geography of Greece, of course, also the political geography of Greece, which was completely different from the political geography of Greece we know from the subsequent age of literacy, beginning, 800 BC or whatever you want to begin it. Because in the interim, the Dorian invaders had come in from the north. They had established Dorian cities, which had not existed at the time of the Trojan War and which were not mentioned. So the political geography of Greece of the Iliad is totally different from the political geography of the Greece where the Iliad was being recited a few centuries later. The last genius in this series, and I mean, those whom the gods love die young. You see from my chronology, I believe Milman Parry lived to the age of 32. He was killed in a freak accident, I think in California. The next in the list is Michael Ventris. Michael Ventris was a Englishman who, like Schliemann, never went to a university. And the Englishman who had bought and basically looted the Knossos in Crete had found a great deal of written material in Crete, which he couldn't decipher. He had no idea what it was. So finally, after 40 years of sitting on this material, after 40 years of sitting on this material, he allowed others to look at it to see if they could figure out, because he hadn't been able to in 40 years, to see if they could figure out what the writing was about. The official British archaeological view was that the writing was a mixture of languages, including Lycian and other languages from Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, which were not even known. In other words, the official British archaeological view was the written language which they had recovered in Crete, called Linear B, was a mixture of unknown languages. Now, how the hell you could decipher anything which is a mixture of unknown languages is beyond me. But Ventris got a hold of it, a very brilliant man, again, speaking a dozen European languages, including Greek. Ventris got a hold of it. He tried to fit the written language into all these crazy theories. And then he said, one evening after dinner, I asked myself, what if it's Greek? And he said, by morning, I had deciphered all the documents I had. It was Greek. It was Greek from, again, a far earlier period than Greek was supposed to exist. It was Greek from the period, before 1200 BC, maybe 1200 BC to 1800 BC, which wasn't supposed to exist. Written, of course, in a totally different way from the way we write Greek or anything else today. So Ventris deciphered these documents from Knossos, and then they got documents from other ancient Greek cities, Mycenae among others. Also, the capital of Nestor, Pylos, I think it was called, and they were all written in the same language. Unlike the Greece we knew then and we know now, where people speak different dialects, everybody in Greece, all the way to Cyprus, had apparently spoken pretty much the same kind of Greek, and it was what we call it today, Mycenaean Greek, for reasons which are clear, I guess, from what I said, because that was the first dig. So the this book, the Iliad. So what is a classic? I mean, is Lord of the Rings a classic? Well, this book, the Iliad, has opened up a whole history, as I say, which nobody knew existed at all before 1870, and knowledge is totally recent, unnecessarily so, because of the domination of the whole field by really know-nothing British archaeologists. I mean, they basically are known. They were also the occupying power in Egypt, and I mean, they couldn't figure out the hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics, the Egyptian hieroglyphics, are consonant sounds, just like Hebrew letters. But the British thought they were animal pictures for some religious thing, and they just never got a clue. And it was only when Napoleon made a lightning raid on Egypt and brought in French scientists that people first understood what the Egyptian hieroglyphics were, after the British had sat on them for at least a century, but I think more. The Greek oral poets had tiled the history of Greece. We don't know fully to what extent, but the Iliad and the Odyssey we have are only two parts of a whole series of poems which cover the history of Greece from before the from before the Trojan War through the end of it. I mean, as you know, if you've read it, and I said also, the Trojan War doesn't end at the end of the Iliad. There was a subsequent epic poem on the end of the Trojan War, which has been lost, called the Sack of Troy. What followed that was the homecomings of the Greek heroes. So this was a subsequent epic, which we've lost. We only have small fragments, called Homecomings. But you know about it. You see, the Iliad is the center of Greek culture. Everything spreads out from that. So you don't have the epic poem, The Homecomings. But if you know Aeschylus, you know what happened when Agamemnon came home. His wife killed him. So this is one of many homecomings. They were not happy homecomings. Neither was Odysseus. But that was, again, Homer got to write Odysseus going back. But all the other heroes' homecomings were written by other epic poets, presumably not as good, and they have been lost. But what is seen in the homecomings is the Dark Age coming on Greece after the Persian War, the sinking into a dark age. And so, I mean, it raises the question, as does Plato's dialogue, I think it's Critias, of the end of civilization, or the eclipse of civilization, or in the case of Critias, the end of civilization. What causes civilizations to end? And what can be done? This is the question which the whole cycle of epics, those which we possess, those which we don't possess, but the ones which we don't possess we possess in some other way, like Virgil's Aeneid in Latin drew heavily on the Greek epic, which was available to him, but not to us, called the Sack of Troy, which immediately followed the Iliad. So these things are available to us. What happened before the Trojan War is captured in the play, at least the play we have of Euripides, Iphigenia and Aulis, which again, presages the Iliad, and again presages the collapse of Greece into a dark age. What were the reasons? I mean, so here we're discussing classics. What is a classic? We're discussing philology, because philology is the general term for what I've described around the progress of the Iliad through our times, what it's meant to us, what it's enabled us to do. This is philology. This is classical philology. The people who did this, although they were spat on by their profession, Schliemann. I mean, look up Schliemann on any place on the internet. You'll see he was a liar. He was greedy. He was everything. Why? Because he made these discoveries. And as I pointed out, both Ventris and Parry ended their life in their 30s having made one great discovery in freak accidents for whatever reason. But in any case, so what this is the classics, properly understood. It's the classics, it's philology, and it's the progress of philology in the classics, tracing the development of the Greek language, the concept of man, and the concept of man, his relationship to God, the nature of man in God's image, and therefore the nature of the gods, from Homer through Aeschylus and Plato. And this is the sort of education which the founding fathers of our country themselves had, whether self-educated or otherwise, and which they advocated for future citizens, because the responsibility of the country is ultimately, or the fate of the country ultimately lies in the mentality, the quality of mind, the quality of thinking, the quality of morality of the population. There's no way, I think there's no leadership which can successfully exist absent the required moral, intellectual development of the population. And the classics are the works which teach us that kind of moral and intellectual elevation. I mean, always for me, the illustration of that is the opening scene of Julius Caesar, because the opening scene of Julius Caesar is a riot, and the population is just madly rioting, and throwing things around and acting crazy, and some people come in and try to stop it without any great success. That's where it opens. It goes from there. And what does it say to you? Well, there is no leadership. The Roman people is utterly corrupt. And there is no leadership which is going to succeed. And this is what, I mean, in Shakespeare and in life, it's the same thing. Shakespeare is one of our greatest historians. This is what Brutus had to face. This is what Cicero had to face. Cicero went to the camp, of his faction, opposing Caesar and came back and said, yes, I saw the camp. Everything was wrong but the cause. You know, they were fighting on the right side, but in every other respect, they were a hopeless mess. So I want to leave time for discussion, and I just wanted to say, as I promised, that to introduce in my own way the next 2 weeks. As I say, the first will be by Bruce Director. Now, what LaRouche said is that the mathematics and physics, really, as I see it, you know, mathematics and physics are one thing, with mathematics as a tool of physics. I think that, I don't know that LaRouche ever exactly said it in those words, but that, I think, is his view. There is not a separate pure mathematics per se. That mathematics cum physics can be approached at the beginning stage through geometric construction, where the ability to construct is used rather than formal proof from axioms. And we can bring students from there, beginning that training at an early age. I don't remember the age he said, but it's certainly very in the first grade or two. Beginning it, you can bring people to the level of approaching Riemannian physics, or approaching Riemannian physics by the time they leave 12th grade. So I think Bruce is far better able than me to present that, and I think he'll do so. Lynn also includes specifications for music. It's saying that I may have said this before in this course, but saying that in preschool, that canons can be introduced as a form of play, even leading to the children themselves composing canons as a form of play. So the canon is an elementary form, right? It's the same theme recurs on top of itself repeatedly, is what a canon is, as people know. Can you want to tell them a canon, Keisha? A Frere Jacques, Frere Jacques.
Row, row, row your boat.
Row, row, row. Okay.
Yes.
These are canons which are
Simple,
certainly suitable in preschool.
right.
So
Beethoven has a lot of them. But
canons can be introduced as to introduce the notion of polyphony, polyphonic, and then the children themselves can compose canons, bringing themselves on to the starting point of learning the well-tempered system, so that he says an ensemble at a high school, 8 through 12 or 9 through 12th grade level could perform a work like Mozart's Ave Verum. So again, Miwa Steger, who's a professional level musician, is far better to would present that far better than I would, and she's going to do that in 2 weeks. So that's it from me, and I'd love to have any questions, discussion.